the number of vulnerable and food insecure people it can assist from October onwards, and they're urgently appealing for $567 million to meet the most pressing needs in the 3 provinces over the next 6 months. On the occupied Palestinian territory, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs warns that humanitarian needs are deepening because of restrictions of movements of Palestinians inside the West Bank. This undermines their access to livelihoods and essential services such as healthcare and education. OCHA has identified 645 obstacles that restrict movement across the West Bank, which represents an 8% rise from the last survey that was done in 2020. All the mapped obstacles are inside the occupied Palestinian territory rather than on the Green Line. And under international law, the Israeli authorities have the obligation to facilitate the free movement of Palestinians within the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and only certain security-related exceptions are recognized. In Pakistan, the UN Children's Fund today warned that 1 year after the historic floods that devastated the country, millions of children continue to need humanitarian assistance and access to essential services. UNICEF said that recovery and rehabilitation efforts remain underfunded, and that these season's monsoon rains are worsening already challenging conditions for flood-affected communities. UNICEF estimates that there are still 8 million people, around half of whom are children, that continue to live without access to safe water in flood-impacted areas. And their current appeal is of $173.5 million to provide life-saving support, but it's still only just 57% funded. And I have one note on the Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia, and Americas, Miroslav Jenča. He will be in Cyprus from the 27th to the 29th of August for separate meetings with the Greek Cypriot leader, Nikos Christodoulides, and the Turkish Cypriot leader, Ersin Tatar, and their representatives. The discussions are expected to focus on the way forward on the Cyprus issue and recent developments on the ground. And I've been asked about the latest developments in Guatemala, and I can tell you that the Secretary General notes that the second round of elections in the country took place in an orderly fashion, as underscored by the OAS and EU observers. He is, however, concerned by reports of attempts to undermine the results of the election in which Bernardo Arévalo garnered the majority of the votes by means of prosecutorial action against members of the Electoral Tribunal, the electoral boards, and political parties. He recalls that electoral institutions should undertake their work in an independent manner, respecting the free expression of the will of the electors. And finally, I have a note from our colleagues from the Global Communications Department. I'm delighted to announce that the UN News app is going live now. The UN News multimedia app across 9 languages is bringing you breaking news, insightful interviews, in-depth features, photo stories, and live streaming of major meetings. It has been launched, live for about 5 years, but today they're launching a new iteration of it, and the enhanced app includes new features. If you haven't downloaded it, you should. I encourage you to. And if you already have it, you should have received the update, but just check just in case. And I think that is it from me. We'll start today with Deji.
Hi, Francia. Yesterday, you mentioned in South Africa, the Secretary General had multiple bilaterals with different countries' world leaders. I noticed that he actually met with the Foreign Minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov. Can you give us more information on their meetings?
Right. What I can tell you is, yes, he met with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. They discussed issues related to the Black Sea Initiative and the MOU on Russian food and fertilizers. But that's really it. Those were the topics that they discussed. And the other bilateral that I'm aware of is that he met with the president of Burundi, and they discussed issues on the Great Lakes and Niger. That's it. Yes, Kirsten. Happy Friday.
Hi, thank you. Florencia, we have sources in Africa who are telling us that the MINUSMA base in Beir, which I believe UN forces left on the 13th, ahead of schedule because of security concerns, is now taken over by Wagner Group. Do you have any confirmation of that or any comment on that?
All we can say is that each time the mission closes a camp as part of its withdrawal process, it will conduct procedures with the Malian Civilian Authority to formally return the site to the transition government of Mali. This is according to our policy. But once that happens, I have no way of verifying what happens after that, right? Especially since we've physically left the location.
So the government could have turned that base over to Wagner Group?
That is not for me to comment, but for you to speculate.
The video of Prigozhin that was put out in the last week, the last time he was seen internationally before he died, reportedly was in Mali. Do you know if that's where he was, or is that something that the Secretary General has been watching or was aware of?
I can't confirm where this happened. Deji again, yes.
A follow-up. Since the UN has no information about the whereabouts the video showed about Prigozhin as well as the death or others, I just want to know what is the basic general position from the UN on mercenary groups in operations in multiple countries. Does UN think that should be something to concern, or it's up to the sovereign countries to decide whether to hire those groups?
I mean. Thanks, Deji. No, that's all right. No need to apologize. Listen, while we don't comment, we're not making any comments directly on any of those developments. I think we have seen the sort of the negative effects that these groups can have. There have been reports by human rights organizations about the potential negative effects that they can have on the ground, and it's different than when it happens when it's the country's own military. There's the accountability is not there, right? So that is all I would say at this point, that it comes with a lot of risks. And right now, we will see what will happen in the region, as we know that mercenary groups are operating in many parts of the world. Quite frankly, we've seen a proliferation of them more and more. Any other questions today? We're gonna make it a little easier for me on Friday. Okay, if that's the case, have a good weekend, and Stefan will be back with you on Monday.
The 9,405th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Undersecretary General, United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. Ms. Natalia Gurman, Executive Director, Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, and Ms. Farida Khalaf, survivor, activist, and president of Farida Global Organization. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of council members to document S/2023/568, the 17th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL, Daesh, to international peace and security, and the range of United Nations efforts in support of member states in countering the threat. I now give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Voronkov.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Excellencies, I thank the Security Council for the opportunity to present the 17th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security and the United Nations efforts in support of member states to counter the threat. I'd like to start by expressing my sincere condolences to the governments and people of all member states who have suffered from terrorism. Earlier this week, the Secretary General helped mark the 6th International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. The horrific impact of terrorism on the lives and livelihoods of so many people give impetus to our common efforts to counter and prevent it. The victims and survivors of terrorism continue to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of sustaining multilateral efforts against Daesh and terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. On 19th of June, the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, together with a group of friends of victims of terrorism, held a dedication ceremony to plant the victims of terrorism solidarity tree at the United Nations headquarters. This tree will stand as a timeless and powerful symbol of the commitment of the United Nations and the international community to protect and promote the rights of victims of terrorism. Madam President, Excellencies, I am pleased that Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, Ms. Natalia Gurman, is joining me today to present this report, which our offices prepared jointly with the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team led by Mr. Justin Hastvedt. As highlighted in this and previous reports, Daesh and its affiliates continue to constitute a serious threat in conflict zones and neighboring countries. However, the threat level remains low in non-conflict areas. This analytical distinction can obscure what is the complex, context-specific, and dynamic nature of how these groups operate and evolve, and their impact on international peace and security. In parts of Africa, the continued expansion of Daesh and affiliated groups, as well as the increasing level of violence and threat, remain deeply concerning. The Daesh affiliate in the Sahel is becoming more and more autonomous and increasing attacks in Mali, as well as Burkina Faso and Niger. The confrontation between this group and Al-Qaeda affiliates in the region, coupled with the uncertain situation after the coup d'etat in Niger, present a complex and multifaceted challenge. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, attacks by terrorists and other armed groups have also risen, with continued clashes between government forces and terrorist groups. In the eastern region of the country, some 500 persons have perished due to terrorist violence. Conflict and instability in Sudan have also renewed the attention on the presence and activity of Daesh and other terrorist groups in that country. Beyond Africa, the situation in Afghanistan is growing increasingly complex, with fears of weapons and ammunition falling in the hands of terrorists now materializing. The in-country operational capabilities of Daesh's so-called Khorasan province, sanctioned as ISIL-K, has reportedly increased, with the group becoming more sophisticated in its attacks against Taliban and international targets. Moreover, the presence and activity of some 20 different terrorist groups in the country, combined with the repressive measures put in place by the Taliban de facto authorities, the absence of sustainable development and a dire humanitarian situation pose significant challenges for the region and beyond. This complex picture remains despite successful counterterrorism initiatives by member states. This has been progress in targeting Daesh finances and leadership cadre, including the death of Daesh leader earlier this year, confirmed by Daesh itself after the report's completion. These measures had a notable effect on the group's operations in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, as well as elsewhere. Counterterrorism initiatives in Egypt, Mozambique, and Yemen have also significantly limited the ability of terrorist groups to conduct operations, yet the risk of resurgence remains. As a result of counterterrorism efforts, Daesh has moved to adopt less hierarchical and more networked decentralized structures, following Al-Qaeda's footsteps, with increased operational autonomy by its affiliated groups. While there is little evidence that the core leadership is exercising command and control of regional affiliates, financial, propaganda, and other connections remain. Perhaps most notably, the typical surge in Daesh violence during the month of Ramadan did not materialize in 2023. The situation in camps and detention facilities in the northeast of Syrian Arab Republic that hold individuals with alleged links to Daesh and other terrorist groups has been dire for many years and is unlikely to improve soon. Although the increased pace of repatriations, mainly by Iraq, is welcome, tens of thousands of people, mostly women and children, are still stranded in camps and detention facilities with unpredictable consequences for regional and international security. Madam President, Excellencies, I offer 4 key observations for this Council's consideration. First, compliance with international law, including international human rights law and humanitarian law, remains the essential bedrock for the success of counterterrorism efforts. Actions that contravene these legal obligations only undermine global efforts against terrorism. Effective counterterrorism requires inclusive approaches and gender-responsive measures. Second, the persistent challenges posed by terrorism underline the need for counterterrorism initiatives to be firmly grounded in political strategies for resolving the conflict that fuel terrorism the most. Force alone cannot lead to changes in the conditions conducive to terrorism. Indeed, the use of force with no backing of clear strategy and not anchored on international law can be counterproductive, fueling more violence, aggravating grievances exploited by terrorists, and creating conditions conducive for the proliferation of terrorist groups. And in this regard, the Secretary General, in his policy brief on a new agenda for peace, has called for a new generation of counterterrorism operations led by African partners with the Security Council mandate under Chapters 7 and 8 of the United Nations Charter, with guaranteed funding through assessed contributions. These operations should align with the full range of the United Nations tools and mechanisms for responding to crises. Third, prevention. The nature of the threat posed by Daesh underscores the need for more complementarity between security responses and preventive measures. Further efforts are required to prioritize and significantly increase investment in prevention efforts. The integrated and balanced implementation of the 4 pillars of the United Nations Global Counterterrorist Strategy would help ensure this very point. Finally, developments in some parts of Africa are deeply concerning and interconnected with existing conflicts and local grievances. The African Counterterrorism Summit, being organized by the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and the government of Nigeria to be held in Abuja next year, will offer an opportunity to redouble international support and explore transcontinental approaches to address this situation. Madam President, Excellencies, the General Assembly's adoption of Resolution 77/298 on its 8th review of the United Nations Global Counterterrorist Strategy sustained the long-standing multilateral consensus on counterterrorism. The adoption of this resolution should serve as a reminder that consensus does not come easy. However, once achieved, it reaffirms the unity of member states against terrorism. Countering and preventing terrorism require long-term commitment as well as continued and coordinated efforts. I welcome the support expressed by all stakeholders at the 2023 United Nations Counterterrorism Week in New York to multilateral efforts to counter terrorism and look forward to the close collaboration with partners on key priorities identified during the high-level conference of heads of counterterrorism agencies of member states. The United Nations, including the Office of Counterterrorism and the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, will continue to support member states in their endeavor to address the scourge of terrorism. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Voronkov for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Natalia Gurman.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, my sincere thanks to the members of this Council for the opportunity to brief you on the 17th report of the Secretary-General on the threat posed by Daesh. I would also like to thank Under-Secretary-General Voronkov for his overview and to commend both the UN OCT and the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team for the close collaboration in formulating the report. Madam President, as the report makes clear, Daesh remains agile and ambitious despite its diminished territorial control. In my briefing, I will highlight 4 key trends from reporting period. First, terrorist activity has continued to occur predominantly in the context of existing conflict. A fragmented geopolitical landscape, including the presence of terrorist groups operating across multiple regions, the emergence of new conflict areas, and growing complexities in armed conflict situations have created additional challenges for member states and made the resolution of conflicts more difficult. As highlighted in the Secretary-General's new Agenda for Peace, this trend requires a comprehensive approach that integrates a willful pursuit of peace while also addressing the root causes of violence and conditions that may be conducive to radicalization to terrorism, rather than continuing solely with over-securitized responses in countering terrorism. Second, the report welcomes the continued efforts of member states to repatriate its citizens from the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic, including some for the first time, which is a commendable development. We must acknowledge the complex challenges member states face in addressing the dire situation in camps in northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic, especially with regards to women and children associated with Daesh foreign terrorist fighters. At the same time, we must also recall the responsibility of member states to bring terrorists to justice and to demonstrate international cooperation in efforts to do so. This also requires whole-of-society and whole-of-government approaches to the prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters. The United Nations continues to assist member states who are facing the challenges related to the return of their nationals, including through the Global Framework for United Nations Support on Syrian Arab Republic and Iraq, third country national returnees. Through that framework, the United Nations is providing support